We are back on another edition here of the Gold Standard on Fox 19 Now with Charlie Goldsmith. I'm Joe Danneman. We talk Reds and Bengals on this podcast. We get you in and out in about 30 minutes or less. Let's start with the Bengals. What a gift from the NFL. The Bengals have a bye week, but still we get a very newsy week with the trade deadline. Let's start right there. The Bengals decided not to move Trey Hendrickson at the trade deadline. Two-part question. Is that the right move, and were you surprised?
I don't think it was the right move because I think very few things in sports have existed for 100 years, and one of them is the concept of buyers and sellers. Sellers should be sellers for a reason. There's a reason why we all agree to do this. However, I understand it from the fact that the Bengals have so many evaluations they need to make, including the coaching staff, including the scheme, including a lot of young pieces on that defense. Take Shamar Stewart, for example. If you trade Hendrickson and he's your number one pass rusher the rest of the season, that's probably not a fair way to evaluate Shamar Stewart or the coaching staff or the front office. Keep going up. With Trey, you at least give yourself, one, your best chance to cling to whatever playoff hopes you feel like you might have. Two, you save it from feeling like a lost year, which I understand the value in. And three, it gives you a fair ability to kind of evaluate everyone that you have here.
Okay, the other part of the question was, were you surprised? Or is this just what the Bengals do?
And I'm not surprised when the Bengals take a conservative approach to team building. 68 years or however long they've done so. Now, even more something I would have been a proponent of would have been buying and selling, trading Hendrickson and using some of those draft resources to go out and get a player who could help the Bengals in 2025 and beyond. Heck, think of it as what the Cowboys did with Logan Wilson. Like, the Bengals could have used a guy like that at a bunch of different positions who would have upgraded them this year and been written in pen into a starting spot for next year, but they didn't. Again, their conservative approach, for better or for worse.
I agree with your take there, and I said the same thing this week, that the Bengals would have been smart to trade some of these players like Logan Wilson. You aren't going to get a difference-making quality level player. But for Trey Hendrickson, you might be able to, or even if you traded Trey Hendrickson and got value back in assets of draft capital, you can then flip that draft capital and get known commodities. Because what's the biggest concern right now for the Bengals? That even if they were to get draft picks, how do we know they're going to use them correctly? They used 5 draft picks on defensive players last year, and they haven't panned out so far here in their rookie year. You can go back several years of draft picks of guys who didn't hit. So if they were able to trade a Trey Hendrickson, get draft picks, flip that, and get a known commodity that could help this team this year and help them going on beyond, it could have been like the Scott Rowland trade, right?
Yes.
Where you're adding a great player to a team that's not yet ready, but that next year maybe you are ready and you can add a veteran guy that we know as a known commodity that could help. Okay, the player they did trade was Logan Wilson. How did it get to this point with Logan Wilson, a guy that was voted a team captain, a guy that they looked at defensively before the year as one of the most important players on the defense, and here we are 10 weeks into the season, and the Bengals traded him. And he demanded a trade, and he got it, and he's out of town now. How did it get to this point with Logan Wilson?
You got to start with how high expectations were for him heading into week 1. In week 3, an interesting moment in this story is they start giving Barrett Carter a few snaps, but truthfully what that was a plan to kind of, to use an NBA term, load management with Logan Wilson to keep him fresh for the whole season. They were thinking the long run with Logan, but he was only on the team for 6 more weeks. 3 weeks after that rotation started, the offense was terrible. The team's playoff hopes were looking pretty thin. It was heading into the Green Bay game. They said, you know what, this just isn't good enough. It's a defense that, as Zack Taylor has said publicly, needed more leadership, needed more energy, needed more of a dynamic gear, and needed someone who could help bring others along with them. And there's no other way to read the move of benching Wilson for Barrett Carter as belief that Carter represented a higher upside for what the defense could either look like in 2026 or as soon as this December. Now, we'll see. Carter's really struggling. I'd argue that the decision to bench Wilson cost them each of the last 2 games. You know, Wilson makes a couple more tackles. Let's say, you know, they don't allow 42 points again. The decision to bench Wilson was the consequential one. Once you bench him, sure, your captain, your veteran's going to want to be out once he's not playing over a rookie. That was kind of exactly how you would expect it to go. But I keep looking back at that decision to bench him in the first place.
So this does clear the runway, though, right, for Barrett Carter and Demetrius Knight now to be the guys in that room that no one can challenge as far as a leadership quality goes. Because, listen, when there's a guy like Logan Wilson in the room, even if he's not starting, even if he's not playing, he's still there. It's a presence that sometimes can be intimidating for a young guy to think he can step up and be that guy in the room. How does this get better for Barrett Carter and Demetrius Knight? Because if you look at whatever metrics you want to,
it's been bad.
They are two of the lowest rated linebackers in the entire NFL, and the Bengals are betting on these guys to play them now and that they start to develop. That's the one thing, right? You want to see flashes, you want to see moments, you want to see, okay, even if you take your lumps now and the growing pains now, it's going to pay off in the future. Do you see that? Is that part of the plan now for the Bengals, that they can see a vision where Barrett Carter and Demetrius Knight start to mature into difference-making players?
You can't know, but this is their chance. And to use a baseball analogy, sometimes you give that chance to Jose Barrero, but sometimes you give the chance to TJ Friedel, and that works. And I think that's a very similar comparison here. It's just which end of that spectrum are Demetrius Knight and Barrett Carter. It's a low starting point right now. Like, the Bears rubbed it in their face. They ran every trick play in the book. Because what those trick plays do, it's eye candy. It's, hey, look at this. And Barrett and Demetrius go, oh, that. And then something going on completely behind them that they miss, whether or not it's a throwback, a play-action pass, a Philly special. Failures over and over again from them there, plus tackling problems, just fundamental stuff they need to develop, reading an offense, tackling, their approach in specific one-on-one scenarios. There's a lot of true coaching work that has to be done. Will it work? I guess we'll all see, right? We'll tune in on Sunday.
Besides saying getting Trey Hendrickson back, because that will help, I would argue that if the Bengals had their closer on the field against the Jets and against the Bears, they might have won both games. But he wasn't on the field, and they lost both games. So besides getting him back and having him be the difference maker he is, how does this get better defensively for the Bengals the final 8 weeks of the season? I
don't think there's a clear path. I think Hendrickson's one card. I think you hope that the coaching and the development from Knight and Carter takes them from a D level to a C level, maybe a C+ level as the season goes along. I think you hope that a Miles Murphy turns the corner or Chris Jenkins turns the corner, but I haven't seen that from either of them. No one's turned the corner. Jordan Battle's been getting worse as the season's been going on. Dax Hill coming off a torn ACL. He looks like a guy who's hit a bit of a wall. Cam Taylor-Britt's been an absolute roller coaster just in terms of production and performance. That's been impossible to predict. I don't even know who I want on the field in specific situations. To me, there's no clear path except for ideally you coach the heck out of these guys and you add way more talent this offseason.
One of the big talking points for Bengals fans after Sunday's game was who did and who didn't talk. And I know you're more of an analytics as opposed to a locker room vibes guy. I'm
a locker room vibes guy.
Okay, well, let's dive into it then, because that was a big talking point after Sunday's game. Who talked, who didn't talk, who said what? And are we starting to see cracks now inside the Bengals locker room? I can tell you, after covering this team for more than 2 decades, it does feel different in there right now. There's no doubt about it. And how couldn't the offense look out of the side of their eye or point fingers at the defense, considering what they've done here the last month with Joe Flacco as quarterback? What's your general feeling and general take on what the locker room looks and feels like right now?
Let me start with the guy who did talk, notably Chase Brown. If he doesn't curse, he's fine. He's clear. He's in the clean. If he says, we've got to finish the game, here, I'm Chase Brown. We've got to finish the game.
Yeah.
All right, sure, yeah. But because he cursed, all of a sudden it's viral and it gets away from himself. But I think the message there was fine from a player who I think, aside from their superstars, might be their best locker room presence and culture driver on the entire team. I'm not going to name names as I get into the guys who didn't talk, but there are guys who behind the scenes, through what you see on the field, through what you see in practice, through what you see in the locker room, and honestly, a part of this job, through what you see in one-on-one relationships that I have with these guys personally. There are guys who I give a benefit of the doubt of when they're like, I just can't do it today. Some people have that earned credibility with me. And again, I won't name those names. But when those guys say, I just can't do it today, and then in one case, apologize to you again, twice after that, that's the reason you have that relationship, for the back and forth and the earned credibility there. But then there were also players in that locker room who I haven't seen invest as much into the locker room around them, who I haven't seen invest as much into what they're going to be from a leadership and a presence and an accountability, and even as innocuous as this sounds, a one-on-one media relationship type thing as well. When those guys kind of say, no, we're not doing this, that's something I take a lot more criticism of. And I did notice a good amount of that on Sunday.
I think that's one of the best and one of the smartest points I've heard all week of someone talking about this, because I'm with you. I have no problem with a guy that was just embarrassed playing that game saying, I don't want to talk about this today. And I'm okay with that. But it has to come with accountability and credibility of a guy that you say you understand isn't going to make a habit out of this kind of thing, that guy has enough credibility that, okay, we'll give him a pass today. I get it. He'll get us tomorrow. He'll get us the next time kind of thing. I've never had a problem with a guy saying, no, they don't owe us anything, right, as media people. But I do think they owe the fans. I do think they owe their teammates. And that's where I have a problem sometimes with guys that don't want to talk about their performance and relies on then a teammate having to talk about it and answer questions. And that's what happened to Jamar Chase. And that's what happened to Chase Brown, right? That they had to answer the questions about their defense because the defensive players weren't available to talk about that. I'm with you. I'm not going to name names because some of those guys I do give a pass to. But some of those guys I do kind of look at a little bit with a side head turn and say,
because
is
they
this part
haven't
of the...
yet stepped up and said, I am a part of this.
Right.
And that's through what we've seen privately, through what we've heard and been told privately, and then just through interactions with them. I think they're, in any locker room, stronger points and weaker points, and you saw a lot of those weaker points on display last Sunday.
Accountability matters. Zack Taylor has taken a lot of accountability for what's going on this season. How do you think he's handling what's become a very difficult situation and a really hard room to maintain? You heard what he said. He fights like hell every day to maintain the culture inside the Bengals locker room. How do you think he's doing?
How is he handling this? Like, all right, let's criticize the performance. Zack Taylor hasn't done a good enough job of impacting the defense of the 2025 Bengals. But the question is, how is Zack handling this? Zack is steady. Zack is consistent. Zack is poised. And I, over 7 years, haven't heard of any examples, even when it was lower than this, or sensed any of it myself, where Zack has gotten away from those three pillars of who he is. That's kind of his superpower. Again, now here I am praising Zack. Like, the defense has to be better, and that falls on the head coach. There was a game management situation that Zack didn't execute well enough leading up to that missed field goal in the fourth quarter on Sunday. But in terms of what Zack can do from a messaging standpoint, I think that consistency becomes really valuable right now. But one other thing he needs to do a better job of is identifying, developing, and empowering who this next generation of leaders on this defense is going to be. Maybe the Logan Wilson trade is a part of that process as well.
One more point here on Chase Brown, and I think back to that final drive. You talking about a guy that put his body on the line for this team to win the game. Flipping, getting a first down. T. Higgins did the same thing. T. Higgins put his body on the line, high-pointing a football above his head, knowing he was going to fall back with no chance to brace himself. I don't think you can blame the offense right now for looking at the defensive side of the room and saying, hey, guys, look what we're doing. We're doing everything we can. You mentioned Chase was fine outside of the curse word. Do you think he had a point? Do you think he had a point to make when it came to the defense and the offense saying, listen, guys, if you guys aren't going to say anything, I'm going to say something for you? Do you stand behind what Chase Brown said? Is it the fact that he kind of unloaded a little bit some of his frustration?
He said they got to finish the game. I don't think anyone's arguing that they didn't, or that they did a good enough job of finishing that game. I think he said something that was so painfully obvious that it's just, again, I'll say it again, he would have been, it would have been looked over by a lot of people had he just not cursed. Yeah. And that curse, I'm not going to criticize a grown man for throwing a curse word in there, a grown adult for throwing a curse word in there. So I think Chase's message was right. I think his approach behind the scenes was right. The defense honestly needs some more of that. Some more guys saying after the game, we need to finish.
That's right. A lot of people saying they just wanted to see some fire, and they saw it from Chase Brown in that moment when he used not only a curse word, he used the curse word several times during that. One final thought here on the Bengals before we transition into the Reds. And that'll be about this team going forward, right? 8 weeks left. And you mentioned buy and sell a little bit earlier on. I want you to hold on to that thought. We're going to play a little game when we get to the Gold Rush about buying or selling for the Bengals. But looking at this team constructed right now, We've talked so much about the investment and change defensively, with the defensive coordinator, with the number of draft picks. When you look forward towards the future, is there anything to hang your hat on with this defense to say, okay, we've seen this now throughout 9 games of this season. This can carry over to next year. Is there anything you're seeing, or is that right now the biggest issue and the biggest worry is that they've invested so much change, there's not a lot to show for it?
Yeah, I mean, if you're talking individuals, Barrett and Demetrius, like, I want them on my team. Like, I'm not giving up on those guys. I think either could have a bright future, but they're not they're not players you can hang your hat on yet.
Yeah.
Defensively, Miles Murphy just isn't there yet. Shamar Stewart has had a very disappointing rookie season so far. Chris Jenkins has had an even more disappointing second season. Dax Hill I like, but he's been more of a role player than a game changer so far. DJ Turner, the ultimate guy you can hang your hat on in this defense. But now you're having the conversation of he's extension eligible at the end of the year, and what are you paying him, and how are those negotiations going, and what does that mean for Turner's role in the locker room and how the dynamic of how he's feeling. We've seen this a million times with Bengals and contract negotiations. And then they might need 2 new safeties unless Jordan Battle takes huge strides in this second half. And then the coaching, we just haven't seen that yet. The scheme, we just haven't seen that yet. They've been limited in those areas, probably by the personnel they have, but also they haven't elevated the team enough either.
We're coming back to the Bengals when we go to the Gold Rush, including a thought on over-under of win totals and what Joe Flacco did this last week to go play.
Yeah.
And I know you wrote a great story about that, so we're going to hit that just a little bit later. But let's jump to the Reds real quick, okay? So the Reds made some decisions this week when it came to not A-level, maybe even B-level players, but certainly players that fans recognize, including Austin Hayes. They decided not to pick up the club option on Austin Hayes. Do you think that's the correct move for the Reds to let Austin Hayes to go to free agency?
Well, the option was $12 million, and I don't think Austin Hayes is a $12 million player, just if you look at comparisons and such. But the Reds now desperately need to replace Austin Hayes. Heck, I throw in even a guy who's just a true free agent, Miguel Andujar. We talked several times during the course of the season about how those guys were saving the Reds' offense, it felt like at times. And if you would have taken both of those guys out for the entire year, of course, Andujar was only here for the second half, man, what would that have looked like?
Sure.
That's what the Reds are right now. And they only have about $20 to $25 million of payroll flexibility to use right now. They would have had to have used about half of that had they picked up that option on Austin Hayes. I think they'll kind of try to find the next Austin Hayes. Maybe that's Hayes himself. There's probably still a chance he returns. He loved playing in Cincinnati. But that tier of has a bit of a question. With Hayes, that's his injury history. With others, it's strikeouts. With others, it's defense. But those kind of interesting but not perfect outfielders, that's a pretty strong tier of the free agent market. So I'm interested to see what the Reds do in that area.
Terry Francona was a guest on 700 WLW's Hot Stove League, and Terry Francona had a lot to say. You found some of it interesting. What was your biggest takeaway from Terry Francona? This had to be his first time public interview since the end of the season. What was your takeaway?
Yeah, the theme he kept hitting back on was, he said, we have to be a deeper team next year. He stressed the importance of depth. And the thing that's on, how many times have we been asked, Kyle Schwarber? Well, Kyle Schwarber doesn't equal depth. What this team has is, I believe, 10 guys who you feel pretty confident are going to play a role on next year's team. I think one of those would include, and then, you have Will Benson and Sal Stewart competing for spots. I think Sal's in a very strong position. But if your priority is building depth, you want to build a roster that has Sal and Benson competing for a roster spot, competing for a role. You need to add multiple players to do that. So what I took away from Francona's comments was what would be the importance of the Reds adding multiple position players, kind of probably some smaller, maybe more platoon-oriented, more defense-oriented type of guys, as opposed to just trying to chase the best middle-of-the-order presence they could possibly afford for this offense.
You want 30 seconds to say whatever you want to say about Kyle Schwarber in Cincinnati.
Sorry, I did the math. They've got $20 to $25 million. I forget, because I read today what ESPN's projection from Schwarber was going to be, but I think it was above 30.
Yeah.
Now, they're not going to get Schwarber. An interesting question is, with the non-tender deadline looming, do the Reds try to do something extremely creative, bold, by dealing a Singer or a Lux, or even crazily non-tendering them? I wouldn't expect that. But would they just rather free that money up to add to the pool even though I think those, $12 million for Singer, $5 million for Lux are the fair price points for them. Like, do they feel like they need to even free more money up to accomplish what they want to accomplish this winter? That's the biggest question of them all.
Terry Francona was asked about Elly De La Cruz and his position. You're going to the GM meetings next week. How much do you think this is going to be talked about in the offseason, Elly De La Cruz and his future of what position here in Cincinnati?
Here's my take. I think by the time we do the show next week, we need an answer on that. Because no one's come out and said Elly is our shortstop in 2026. Now, there are a few fine second basemen on the market. If you wanted to, you could make that your priority. You'd probably be pretty mad at second base, but then that will give you the flexibility to move Matt to short and Elly to center.
Yeah.
But to me, that doesn't feel like what gives you the best team in 2026. I would still expect some realistic improvement from Elly from a throwing perspective, even though he might not get to every ball kind of coming in down to his left. But I think you have to decide what you're going to do with Elly first before you shape your offseason plan. I think the Reds would be best served from a communication perspective with a superstar player, and then from a planning perspective to just go out and say next week, Elly's either a center fielder, which would be crazy, or more likely a shortstop.
I know it's not the sexiest topic, but is it still the number one priority for the Reds in the offseason when they look towards player acquisition? Is it still the bullpen that you're most interested in?
So, I mean, there was a story Terry Francona tells. He remembers being at the winter meetings in December last year, and the Reds at the time only had one catcher, Tyler Stevenson, and he remembers stress isn't the right word because there's always stress when you're a front office executive, but just we got to add a catcher, another catcher mindset that he said he saw in Nick Krall and Brad Metter, and the market was all over the place, and then they swung a creative deal for Jose Trevino. They did a good job with that. But that's going to be where they're at with the bullpen right now because it's Santillan, it's Ashcraft, Connor Phillips has a leg up. It's 6 prospects who all throw really hard, but I don't know if they're going to throw strikes. How many of those guys can you count on? That's a number they have to decide because do you need to go out and get 4, 3, 2, or 1 more relievers? They need to decide how much of that they're going to do. And if do you spend $1 million on 4 guys or $4 million on 1 guy? These are decisions they'll have to make. The bullpen is wide open, and they need to figure out what they have and what they can do.
The Gold Rush now, rapid fire questions to Charlie Goldsmith as we transition into more Bengals talk here. And I'll begin with Joe Flacco. Joe Flacco's performance against the Bears was what? Fill in the blank.
Hollywood. 40-year-old benched by the Browns, traded, starts 5 days later, goes on a crazy run, gets a terrible blow that he says, or not terrible, but a bad blow that he says, I'm playing through it. I don't know these guys' names, but who cares? And then has statistically the best game of his career. I mean, come on. That was, it wouldn't be like a good movie because I feel like those are always the bad sports movies. But it's the one where the teacher comes out and pitches.
That's right.
It's like the old guy still got it.
Is that the Rookie?
Yeah. I never liked those movies, but it's still a good movie script that maybe other people would enjoy. And I enjoyed watching Flacco do it on Sunday.
I have said the Bengals defense are thieves, that they've stolen one of the best stories in the NFL this season. Because what Joe Flacco's doing, if the Bengals were winning, along with him throwing for more than 1,000 yards his last 3 games, 10 total touchdowns his last 3 games, if they were winning games along with what he's doing, this would be, if not the, one of the biggest stories in the NFL happening right here in Cincinnati. And because the defense can't get a stop, it's become just kind of a footnote what Joe Flacco's doing. But what he did, and Zack Taylor keeps saying, people have no idea what he went through to be able to play against the Bears, and he still went out and toughed it out and performed with one of the best games, if not the best of his career.
Can I tell a joke?
Please.
So, Zach, we know on Monday they show up they've got 2 days of meetings. I believe Tuesday ended up being just for the young guys before the bye. Well, Monday, Zach sent Joe Flacco home. Flacco got to start the bye week early. Of course, he had earned that. But the joke is, I'm imagining they come in on Monday morning for their whole team meeting. Everyone sits down. Zach goes, all right, first, Flacco, you can go.
That's right.
And then he starts the meeting for everyone else. But I'm sure it was handled differently, but that would be funny.
It's like being exempt from an exam when you're in high school. Okay, you got 100 for the year. You're good. You don't have to take the exam. Go home and start Christmas. Okay, next question in the Gold Rush. If I put the Bengals win total at 6.5, they're currently at 3 with 8 games left. Are they going above or below 6.5 wins at the end of the season.
I think they'll do the thing that they did, I believe, right in the mid 2000s or the late 2010s and the late 90s. I mean, they finished this season with the Dolphins, the Cardinals, and the Browns. I think they're going to win 3 straight. Heck, the 2024 Bengals won like 6 straight to end it, and they'll try to be talking themselves into that defensive conclusion in the middle of January. But I think that gives them so much margin for error. So now can the Bengals win one more against, it's a gauntlet, but Steelers, Patriots, Ravens, Bills? Yeah, sure. I'll give them one more, 7 wins.
Okay, so we'll finish the Gold Rush here with 3 names, and I want you to, and we dived into this a little bit last week. If you want to hear more of it, go back to last week's episode. But I want you to describe the temperature of each seat of each person I give you, okay? And I don't love to do this, right? Because these are guys' jobs. Nobody wants anybody to lose a job. And now I'm sure a lot of people listening to this will say, fire Zack Taylor, fire Duke Tobin. That's what fans do, and that's okay. But we're talking about livelihoods, we're talking about families, we're talking about jobs. But the reality is in the NFL, it's a bottom line business. If you don't get results, change happens. Okay, the temperature for Duke Tobin's seat is what?
Should be very hot. And I'm not calling for anyone's job. Look at the results on the field and I keep going back to how many plans failed. Like they're 4 iterations into their plan to fix the safety position in the post-Jesse Bates era. They're like 3 plans into their linebacker for this mid-2020s segment. They're like 7 plans into their plan to replace DJ Reader, which started with signing Sheldon Rankins. Like eventually you've shown that the plans can't work. Now, projecting what Duke Tobin's hot seat looks like equals projecting the feelings of Mike Brown and Katie Blackburn, which, what's the best way to say this? They haven't operated from a patience, from a job security standpoint at the typical pace that you'd see from the other 31 teams. But you're going to ask me about Zach and Al. Like, sure, we'll have those conversations. But Tobin's the one who the most, his performance has failed and would translate into being on a hot seat in a normal environment.
Very hot for Duke. Okay, Zack Taylor now. What's the temperature on him?
Yeah, I think it's mild, warm, somewhere in that range. I think what you really just have to see is, he didn't pick these defensive players. He doesn't coach these defensive players. But you got to make sure that the leaders that he's worked to empower end up in those roles by the end of the season. Like, Barrett Carter has to finish strong from an intangibles perspective. Same with Demetrius Knight. Same with Jordan Battle, who's kind of going through it right now. Like, those are guys that Zach has tried to empower and work through, and with your job as a culture setter. Like, in 2020, he did a fantastic job of that with Von Bell and with Sam Hubbard. Zach did a lot of good work behind the scenes to empower and develop the guys who became the next leaders on the next great Bengals team. That was 1 year later. You have to start to see those signs from the guys in the pipeline right now.
Like Zack Taylor, Al Golden didn't handpick these players. He was given these players to work with. He's halfway through year 1. How hot, how warm, what temperature is his seat?
I've already made my case, made my point about Duke Tobin, but if your whole plan was that a defensive coordinator was going to fix all these players because you think this is one of the best developmental defensive coordinators in football, and then you fire this defensive coordinator 1 year later, well, that's something. But if you have the worst defense in the league, changes have to be made.
Sure.
He's the easiest change to make. Sure, warm, probably the same as Zach with what I said with him, even though that would make the least sense when you look at what's gone on over the last 3 years.
Let's finish with the gold nugget. This is when we dive into Charlie's notebook for a great nugget of an interview or a story you're working on. I would tell you to go read a story on Joe Flacco and everything that went into his game, performing the way he did on Sunday. But I'll leave it to you. It could be Reds, Bengals, anything you want for the gold nugget. What do you have for us this week?
Is my segment. I'm going with the practice squad linebacker who I wrote about. I told Joe about this a couple days ago. I'm calling him Special Teams Flacco. His name's Brian Asamoah II, third-round pick by the Vikings in 2022. He was a useful backup special teams guy for 3 years, but then the Vikings signed his replacement, drafted another, and then found an undrafted free agent who also kind of jumped him on the depth chart. He got cut very early in camp. He bounced around 2 different teams. He ended up in Vegas. Then Vegas cuts him, and he's out of a job. Vegas cuts him from the practice squad. He's out of a job completely. But then Logan requests a trade, and he's hurt. and then Shaka Hayward hurts his fibula. And the Bengals are desperate for linebackers, desperate. They bring in this Asamoah guy, 53. They bring him in on Thursday. Remember, Joe Flacco showed up on Tuesday and played on Sunday. Asamoah showed up on Thursday, played on Sunday. 3 different special teams units: kick coverage, kick return block, punt return block. And on his first snap with the Bengals, even though he hadn't slept all week because he'd been learning the playbook, even though he didn't know the names of any of the guys around him, his very first snap, he blocks for Charlie Jones's touchdown.
How about that?
And he celebrates in the end zone with all these guys who he doesn't even know. And he said, that's the beauty of football. Even in this mess that the Bengals, this defense is in, there are some pretty cool stories. And I think that's one of them.
That was a great nugget. Well done, Charlie. Great story. That'll finish up the gold standard here. When we're back next week, Charlie is back from the GM meetings with Major League Baseball. Very interested to hear what you dig up, what stories you write, what storylines you go with going forward. Certainly, Elly De La Cruz, we talked about him here. I would think around the league, everybody's wondering what it looks like for him going forward, certainly here in Cincinnati position-wise. We'll see you next week. Another edition of the Gold Standard for Charlie Goldsmith. I'm Joe Danavan. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time here on Fox 19 Now.